Dirk Deaton. We're thankful that we can have events like this on campus that are sponsored through our Free Society program here at HLGU, sponsored by the Mormon Grant. So it is my pleasure to introduce you today Dirk Deaton. He is a Missouri House representative. Dirk earned his undergraduate degree in interdisciplinary studies at Liberty University. He also attended Crowder College and Missouri Southern State University. Before he was a representative, he worked for a small Southwest Missouri manufacturer. Deaton was first elected for a 2-year term in November of 2018 and was re-elected in 2020 and 2022. So please join me today in welcoming our speaker, Dirk Deaton.
Thank you, Dr. Turner, for the introduction. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you all here today. And President Matz, thank you for having me as well, for the hospitality last night and today. It's my first time to ever be to Hannibal and to your fine university, and I've been so impressed. It's a beautiful place, and I'm looking forward to hopefully coming back very soon. I am from Missouri. I'm serving the Missouri House of Representatives. It's a good thing I'm from Missouri, but I'm about from as far away from here as you can be and still be in Missouri, which is maybe why I sound like I do. I'm from the southern part of Missouri, the very southwest corner, the corner that borders Arkansas, Oklahoma, and Kansas. That's my district where I come from. So if you ever heard of Joplin, Missouri, I'm an hour south of there. That's still Missouri, just barely. That's where I come from. And so it's so good to be here with you to talk about, our foundations of government, free society, our Constitution, things that I care very much about, very passionate about. You might think that. Hopefully people that do run for office and are elected are passionate about these things. I hope maybe you're passionate about them as well. I think it's very important that we talk about them. We talk a lot about the Constitution, both our federal Constitution and our state Constitution in Jefferson City, in the Missouri House, the Missouri Senate, and you'd probably expect that. Frankly, we probably talk about the Constitution and constitutions generally, form of government in Jefferson City, more than they do in probably a lot of workplaces. It's a good thing we talk about it there. Of course, we have a lot of attorneys that I serve with. I'm not an attorney myself, and oftentimes I think that's a feature more than a flaw. And we have a lot of attorneys in Jeff City. That's a good thing. We need them too. But you shouldn't have to be an attorney, certainly to read and understand, to know what the Constitution is and what it means. And so I think it helps to go back to the very beginning in some respects. How did we get here? And I know, you're on a college campus. You no doubt love dates and hearing them. And so I will not quiz you on these later, I promise you that. But I will give you a few dates here. So you've no doubt heard them before. Maybe you remember that the Constitution, and generally when I'm saying Constitution, unless I'm saying otherwise, of course we're talking about the Constitution we're living under today that's been here for now more than 2 centuries, this federal government. It was signed in 1787. It was ratified by the states in 1788, and it became effective as a form of government in 1789. But what brought us to this point of having this federal government in 1789? And you might think, well, the Revolutionary War, certainly a part of it, not untrue, but I think that does leave out some important context. We had the spirit of 1776, right? The year of the Declaration of Independence. That played into all of this, obviously as well, very important. And again, the war. But if you think about the Revolutionary War, as we call it, that's a war that officially ended with the Treaty of Paris. Here's another date for you, in 1783. Well, this federal government we had today, if you recall, became effective in 1789. So what happened for those half dozen years or so between 1783 and 1789, and frankly even before that, during the war period? What was going on? Was it just total anarchy, chaos? What was the form of government? Well, of course, you go back far enough. We had the colonies, right? And then we had states. If you go to look at Virginia's first written constitution that was adopted by representatives of the people, the first of its kind in that way, in all of human history. It was adopted in 1776, same year as the Declaration of Independence. That said, there was a federal arrangement between the states predating the Constitution we have today. And that is, you probably know, the Articles of Confederation. Now, it's fair to say, I don't think anybody would object, anybody would question that this government only had a Congress, didn't have an executive, didn't have a judiciary, that the Articles of Confederation, that federal government, that federal system was much weaker in its powers than the more central federal government we have today that followed it, the Constitution that followed it. Nobody, I think, questions that, says anything other than that. It's also no doubt true that there were issues arising out of the Articles of Confederation during the period of the war and even after, during that period of peace, before 1789, before there was the new Constitution, a new government. But having said all of that, and you've maybe heard those sorts of things too, I don't believe that our modern history, that the modern orthodoxy has portrayed the Articles in a completely fair and accurate manner. Because I was certainly taught, perhaps you as well, really only ever heard that the Articles of Confederation were just doomed and hopelessly lost and of no value from the very beginning. And this was just objectively true as the sun rising in the east, or to borrow language from the time, that this was just self-evident. Nobody questioned it. Everybody knew it. It was obvious. And again, this is the orthodoxy we seemingly have now. But the reason I think this is flawed is that if you look at the events and the circumstances surrounding the convention that drafted the federal constitution that we still have today, the federal government that became effective in 1789, the Constitution, the government that replaced the Articles of Confederation, what you do not find is that this was just self-evident and the obvious unanimous opinion and realization that the Articles were just irredeemably lost, hopelessly, no value, so on and so forth. It's not to say there weren't those agitating for a stronger federal government, more central government, because there certainly were, even before the Articles of Confederation, and that continued. Yet here is why I say it's nothing like it was a unanimous view to just say, hey, we all just discard the Articles of Confederation, which is exactly what happened. The convention of the states that drafted the federal constitution that became effective in 1789, the one we have today, the convention in Philadelphia that drafted that constitution was a convention whose authority was derived, the call was issued by the Confederation Congress of the Articles of Confederation. That's the government that called this convention in 1787 to take place in Philadelphia for, quote, the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. So the only reason for the convention, right, its only authority under the call was to consider amendments to the Articles, not throw them out. But again, of course, this is exactly what happened. Now, there's a question that is at times considered by those operating out of a biblical worldview, and I try to pay attention to these questions and these conversations because I, like many, or hopefully most of you, all of you, maybe, hopefully, operate out of a biblical worldview. And the question goes something like this. Was the American Revolution right and justified, considering what the Bible says is right and appropriate conduct towards governing authorities, specifically in light of Romans 13? So that's a question. Maybe you've heard that question before. I've heard that question. I've thought about that question numerous times. There were professing Christians during the period in 1776 that came down on both sides of this question, and as I understand it, I think you can find, even prominent theologians today, professing believers who, in 2023, would maybe come down on both sides of that question. But there's another question that's not totally unrelated, that I've never heard asked, that I've never heard considered, that I frankly think is just as challenging and interesting a question, if not more so. And so I'd like to put that before you. And this question is, say something like, was the convention that produced a new constitution and a new government in accordance with or in violation of biblical principles, considering the call of the existing government was for the sole and express purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation? So my goal today is actually not really to answer these two questions specifically. I want to talk about some other things, but I did want to draw your attention to them. And, I understand we might have some time for Q&A afterwards or later. If you're really, really interested in those questions and want to know what I think about them, I'm happy to tell you about them. But more than anything, I frankly don't care what you think about them. I just want you to think. I want you to think about them. And I hope that you will. And I'm sure reasonable people can and will come down on both sides of those questions. But here's what we can all agree on, unquestionably, because it's just true. And that is, right or wrong, the Articles of Confederation didn't last very long. But this Constitution we have now, we've had for some time. It's lasted, it's persevered more than 2 centuries. Thomas Jefferson wrote to James Madison during this time, this being drafted, 1789, during this period, that, quote, the earth belongs to the living. Well, maybe we ought to pay attention to that. That's you and me, right? It's not Jefferson. He's not alive anymore. So he says the earth belongs to us. The earth belongs to the living. So I will tell you, I don't take this to mean what some people do today, that the Constitution itself is alive, that it lives and breathes, that it changes with the times, that the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution, that the general welfare clause are to be given the most expansive meanings to justify virtually any federal act. There are, of course, many people today, including judges and politicians and academics, who have advocated for, and frankly even wielded, government power operating under this theory. I will just say I think it's unlikely, frankly if not impossible for me to believe, that the Constitution we have would have ever been ratified by the states. A very important step. You don't get the government, they can draft a Constitution unless the states had ratified it. That had to happen. And I don't believe that they would have if it had been sold to them in this manner. All right, the state of Virginia or New York, we've got this new Constitution here, and it's probably going to change over time. So, not that we're going to change the words, but it could grow and expand, and I'm not sure they would have liked to have heard that, and that's not really how it was expressed. If you go back and read the ratifying conventions are sold. It wasn't sold in that manner. And I would suggest, it seems to me, that the Constitution should mean what it always meant until or unless it is changed. And then it should mean that. Until or unless, you get the idea, right? And I frankly like how Justice Antonin Scalia put it when he said, and I think it would surprise a lot of people, regardless of what they think of the right proper judicial philosophy is, or where they come on the political spectrum. If they don't know much about Scalia or really his judicial philosophy, I think they would be surprised to hear him say this, that he did say this. He said, quote, a text should not be construed strictly. I think that's what people would be surprised that he would say. But he goes on, okay? He said, a text should not be construed strictly, and it should not be construed leniently. It should be construed reasonably to contain all that it fairly means. So Protestants, evangelicals, are very familiar with having to interpret and understand a text, right? Being people of the book. The Bible is the foundation of our faith, and the right, proper interpretation of biblical text is paramount. Now, whether it's the Bible or the Constitution, we're talking about a text, and people can and do argue about what it means. You've no doubt seen this. But in both cases, we have the benefit of being able to go to a text to have a common point of beginning, a jumping off point, a point that we can all go back to. And this should not be taken for granted, because written constitutions, specifically, when it comes to governments, written constitutions, this is new in the terms of human history, in the terms of governments. And the fact that we have a written constitution, and one that enumerates what government can do, recognizes God-given rights, that's very critical, as well as, I didn't say grant rights, recognizes the rights that you have deriving from your nature, given from the hand of God. That's what's recognized in the Constitution. And the Bill of Rights specifically. This is a practice that really begins with our founding fathers, that generation on this continent. And I think in many ways a written constitution became a non-negotiable for them, and so important because of the context, because of where they came from. In large part, they came from the British constitutional system, right? That's what they lived under. That's what they knew. And it was a constitutional system, but a system in which the Constitution wasn't written down. There was no written constitutional text in the way that we have it. And so they would be, those in the colonies, and they'd say, yeah, government cannot do this, or I have this or that constitutional right. And the British government would say, no, you can't do this, or you can't do that, or you do not have this right or that right. Or Parliament said it's okay, therefore it is. But the point is, they didn't have it written down anywhere. They couldn't go back, they couldn't even argue about what it said, because it wasn't a written text, it wasn't written down. So that is very, very important, I think, for us to remember. And it's also an important principle in the rule of law. I already touched on this just a little bit, but that there's consistency, that there's stability within the law. You want it to mean the same thing until it's changed under an appropriate process. That way, hey, if it's the law, there could be a criminal penalty if you disobey it. And so you want to know what it means, and you want to know that it's going to continue to mean that, quite frankly, because you're going to orient your life around that, believing that it means what it says. We even do this in, of course, sporting contests that you do here on this campus. I'm sure does anybody play basketball here? I don't know if there is here. Probably somebody. Okay, all right, very good, very good. I watch basketball. Don't really play. I like it though. As you can see, I kind of have a body of a debater, so never been much for the athletic contest, but I do enjoy watching them. All right, but just think for me for a moment, if you're playing this game of basketball, and all of a sudden, you pick up the ball, the opposing team picks up the ball and just runs to the hoop, puts it in. It'd be much easier, right? Hey, hold on, wait a minute, right? You can't do that. Rules of basketball, that's a travel, right? They say to you, oh, no, you don't understand. The rules of basketball have been breathing lately. It's alive. Well, no, we don't accept that in a simple intramural contest, right? That's ridiculous, right? And so I would say to you, how much truer should it be when it comes to the law, where there's criminal and civil penalties involved? We want to know what it means, and we want it to continue to mean that, again, unless there's an appropriate process undertaken to change that. That's why I believe that it's an important principle of the rule of law, stability and consistency. Of course, this is not to say that the founders were wiser and were smarter than we are. I'm not saying that, although there might well be a case to make for that. But that's not my point. The point is that they didn't believe that the Constitution could never be changed. All right? They actually changed it themselves. It would have never, again, back to ratification, it would have never been ratified if they hadn't promised to the states the Bill of Rights. Those were amendments. They came early. They came with the same generation. They were amendments to the Constitution. And so they knew that it needed to have that ability to amend. They provided that within the Constitution. Congress could refer amendments to the states to ratify, or the states could come together and propose amendments that they could then ratify. So that's very very important. They knew that people had a right to change it, that they might well have a need to change it in the future. Of course, no one living in the 18th century could have fathomed a nuclear weapon, or that, frankly, America would be the country or the superpower that it is today. Or what about artificial technology? Name any number of things, right? The list goes on almost indefinitely. And so the ability was given through those two methods: Congress referring amendments, the states coming together to propose amendments, and then the ratification process to provide a way to change the Constitution, to amend it. So it's a long way of talking about is the Constitution alive or not. What do I mean by that? In that sense, I don't see it that way. I don't think that's the way it ought to be understood or viewed. I certainly don't believe that myself, that the Constitution is alive or a living document. But there is a sense in which I do believe that it is a living document, and that I could say the Constitution is alive. And before I explain to you that further, think about that for just a moment. But I'm going to read to you now a constitutional provision, okay? And I ask that you listen to this very carefully. So this is a constitutional provision. It's very short. Please listen very carefully. Quote, this is what it says: "The privacy of citizens and all their correspondence, telephone conversations, and telegraphic communications is protected by law," unquote. That's the provision. Have you ever heard that before? Maybe something close to it. Maybe it kind of sounds like a little bit like our Fourth Amendment. You know, have a right to think about the right to privacy, right to, be secure in your persons and papers. Doesn't sound quite like that, but very close. Maybe the same idea. Well, as I said, this is a constitutional provision, and it is. Maybe you would be surprised to find out, to hear, that actually just so happens to be Article 56 of the Soviet Constitution. Now, if you go and read the Soviet Constitution, which isn't a government anymore, collapsed in the early 1990s before most of you were born, if not everyone. Not everyone in this room. Most people probably. But if you go back and read the Soviet Constitution, you will find that there are many provisions like this, actually, that purport to protect human rights. That, boy, on the face, doesn't that sound pretty good? It certainly isn't maybe what you would expect based upon what we know about the Soviet Union. But see, that's the problem with that, right? What's the problem? There was no right to privacy in the Soviet Union. They did not adhere to their constitution and to what it said, which is, I think, something that we should keep in mind and should be a point of concern, right? Because, hey, that said what it needed to, but their constitution had no way seemingly to bind and to constrain the Soviet government. Because, again, there was no right to privacy in the Soviet Union. It was actually experienced by the people living there. As far as the protections that their constitution purportedly afforded, it's completely useless. So I say that our Constitution is alive and is living in the sense that it lives in you. And it is alive in that I think the reason that laws limiting, say, the freedom of expression that are being considered even in Western countries today, in places around the world, are unthinkable here, at least still, hopefully this will remain, is because, not solely because, although that's where it starts, but it's ultimately not because of our First Amendment in the Constitution. But it's because the sentiment of the First Amendment is so ingrained in our culture and in the hearts and minds of the American people that doing anything other, and frankly the people are willing to fight and to stand up for it and demand that it be so, that's why it's unthinkable. So it's two things really, right? You got to have the words. You got to have that this is the supreme law, this is the Constitution, these are our rights. That's important. But you also have to have it, again, in the hearts and the minds of our people, which I believe we do. We still do. And that's what we got to make sure we continue to still have. Jefferson wrote, and I'm fond, I think he had a way of capturing things very well. So Jefferson wrote again, a little bit later than the original quote I gave you, in 1816 this time. I think he perceived something accurately that was true then, it's more true, I believe, today. And he said in a letter that, quote, if a nation expects to be ignorant and free, it expects what never was and what never will be. Which is why, frankly, I think education is so important. What you're doing here is so important. Because our constitutional values must be so inculcated in the people of this country. And that each generation must know and must come to know and understand the enumerated powers of our government and what their rights are, what your rights are as given to you by God and recognized by the Constitution. And knowing them, demand that exact sort of a government. And a never-ceasing vigilance that perpetuates the ongoing security of our natural rights as given to us again by our Creator and secured by prior generations of patriots. And this really is the challenge for citizens today. I think this is the challenge for you and for your generation. It's a challenge each generation must face and must tackle. And it is true also for you that you know the Constitution and that you demand that your government know it, and not only that they know it, but that they live according to it, nothing less and nothing more. Thank you.
We have a little bit of time for questions. So if you have a question, just ask you to stand up where you are. Try to speak loudly so that everybody can hear your question. We don't need to repeat it. So what questions do you have for Representative Deaton today? Any questions?
Not everybody at once. Yeah. It could be that I answered all the questions.
Okay, well, Representative Deaton will hang out a little bit here after we close, and certainly he would, if you want to ask a question privately, he would be glad to field that. But let's thank him again for coming today. You are dismissed.